faith in Buddhism? What does that look like? What is it that is that this or consists of this term shraddha or saddha in the Pali? Here, I'll put it in the chat. How do we think about faith? Often, this is a question that, as a Buddhist teacher, I get very regularly. Let's see. Saddha is the Pali. And the reason that we're going to start with that theme really is kind of the point to, I think in the email I wrote, I had indicated the 5 affirmations, but actually affirmation is the wrong word. I used the wrong term. It's actually 5 invitations. That's what I meant. And I'll explain what those are in a moment. But first, I want to go back and look at Yeshit Tsogyal's autobiography, because Yeshit Tsogyal, before she was a student and partner to Padmasambhava, who brought Buddhism to Tibet in around the 8th century, she was a princess. And we see that often there are many of these great Buddhist teachers and masters who come from great privilege, who, in fact, the Buddha himself had been a prince until he just left that whole life behind him. And we see this often in the great stories of the masters, that they were somehow privileged people living either a royal life, often in that way, who then went on to live an ascetic life and kind of just renounce the futility of the material life for becoming a wandering monk or nun, in the case of Yeshit Tsogyal. Although her status in Buddhism is not just as a nun, it is really sort of as a mother of this great tradition. So she had gotten so much pressure as a princess to marry for practical utilitarian reasons. Princes of other regions were coming and courting her to marry her and all of these, and she just would have none of it. She knew what she wanted. She wanted to find the guru of Odhyana, as Padmasambhava is sometimes called. Odhyana is a lake region, so in the mountains in that part of Tibet, and she had heard about this master and she wanted to learn from him. It was like she was being her heart was being pulled towards this teacher that she had heard about, and she couldn't think of anything else. She really wasn't the kind to be married and such, and wanted to really explore a meaningful life of Dharma. So it's interesting because she knows, in her autobiography, she writes about how she knows how beautiful and sweet romantic love is. She understands the landscape, and she makes it clear to the princes who come that she understands that, and yet it is all in vain. She's seeking, as she puts it, which I'll read in a moment, kind of the sort of the barren landscape, this landscape that is basically free from sort of aesthetic beauty, for the truth, for the true sort of under, what is it? Kind of like, I was going to say under layer, but that's not even right. It's more so the more deeply rooted cultivation of a path. And I think her being fully, so just a reflection here on faith. This term shraddha or saddha, what are we talking about? Since often in Buddhism, there really is no, well, in many of the traditions of Buddhism, that there is no real notion of God per se. When asked about God, the Buddha would respond depending on who was asking the question. So if an atheist was coming to the Buddha saying, "Is there a God?" he would say, "Yes, there is." if a full believer, and I would tend to think that if a Brahmin, a priest who has perhaps in this form of northern India, southern Nepal, or in Tibet. No, I'm sorry, in southern Nepal, where the Buddha taught. This is not Padmasambhava. That if somebody was really strong, full of faith in a God, a conceptual God, he would say, no, there isn't. It really just kind of depended on who's asking the question. Because his point was, you can't possibly know the reality of any God or not. Some people will say, the Buddha said there was no God. This is not accurate. And there are many terms that we find in Buddhism that do tend to relate to deities, such as Brahma, the Brahma Jala, or the great net of Brahma, or Indra Jala, the Indra's net, the jeweled net of Indra, who was a great sort of Hindu god. And you find references to, in later texts, Amitabha Buddha, Manjushri, some of the others in the text. So it's a little more nuanced than just saying, no, there's no God in Buddhism. But it's not that basically the God or the being or the deity is the point. It is rather that faith, as it is discussed in the classic Abhidharma texts, or the psychology of consciousness, that's very sort of list-based, if you've ever read Abhidharma, that the indriya, or the faculties, the capacities that we have, there are seen to be these five capacities. Let's see if I can pull them up here. The very first of 5 faculties that we have that also turn to powers when they're cultivated ardently. The first one is faith, right at the beginning. The first one upon which the others are built, shraddha. Then after that comes energy or vigilance, virya, mindfulness, or sati, or smrti in the Sanskrit. The fourth is stillness, or concentrative stillness, samadhi. And the fifth is wisdom, prajna, or panya. But it's interesting, it starts with faith. And so what kind of faith? What are we talking about here? What does Yeshe Tsogyal, what does she mean about have faith? This is an important thing here. And she doesn't describe what does she mean by faith here. Is it faith in what? Does faith need an object? This is the interesting question. Now, there are many different kinds of terms that are often used to describe faith. One is confidence. Okay, confidence. That's a good word, but it's only one piece of this larger category. Another is trust. Okay, trust is maybe sort of a hopefulness or an intuition that this is okay, perhaps. I don't know how you would define trust. There can be a very deep-seated trust. And yet, faith in this context is not cognitive. It's not just an idea. It's not a wish. Perhaps we might call faith knowing. Just knowing. But still, knowing itself is something we might have faith in. And from a Buddhist view, we might even have faith in not knowing. That actually, by not knowing, we are closer to the truth of things than thinking that we know something. This is very Buddha. This is very much aligned with Buddha's teaching. So you see how we can get into the weeds with this term. And it is interesting, again, that it's seen to be an ability that leads to a power a power that produces the most auspicious outcome on the path. One way we can think of it is as perhaps a trusting confidence. And yet it relies more on listening than rationalizing something. Like, do we need to be convinced to have faith? Well, then it's not really faith, right? So the way that we can sort of visibly see what faith might look like, one way is in the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. So sometimes, we may chant to the three jewels or the three refuges. And there is an aspect of faith by giving ourselves over to the Buddha, the wise one. There is that aspect in giving ourselves over to the teachings. And that may feel uneasy. Well, I'm not sure if I believe in this or that, like reincarnation, transmigration. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if I can have faith in that. The mind comes in and starts doubting things, but it's okay to have questions about these things. But the point is that we have faith that the teachings, that Dharma is really taking us someplace really important. And then faith in the Sangha, or the community, as an ecology, as a system, as a community, a communal experience of supporting our practice, of keeping the path strong, of finding confidence in community, friendship, and even if things get difficult, we may learn about ourselves and others. Communities are often complex. But what is it, though, that constitutes faith? Well, the Buddha said, don't just take my word for it. Put things to the test and see if they're true for you. Don't just believe, even me, categorically. So here there is this realization, perhaps, that is also at the heart of faith, that we start having some, not just confidence, but some deeper insight that we can rely on. And it's in the heart. It's basically not something that we have to constantly question. Another thing I'll read to you here is from Patrul Rinpoche's The Heart Treasure of the Enlightened Ones, The Practice of View, Meditation, and Action. This is by Shambhala. Really great text that outlines a lot of the principles, the basic principles of Tibetan Buddhism. And here he talks about 4 stages in the development of faith. Number 1, clear faith. Here is where you start seeing the qualities of those that are impacting you, the ones who kind of stir your curiosity to learn more about Dharma. Your mind becomes joyful and clear in the presence of maybe the teachings or somebody who's speaking in a way that just feels right to you. If you've ever had a teacher where you just resonate with them, that's part of this, is that the like a broom is sweeping away all the dust on the floor and it's shiny, and you kind of go, yep, this is a place I can walk. And then when this clear faith inspires you to take on those qualities, to seek more, then it's called longing faith. Although I think I would change that. I don't know what the Tibetan word is, but I would probably change it to aspirational faith. So longing faith is more that your heart starts opening and you start feeling that sense of that the path is actually generating now auspicious qualities in you on some level. Let's see if he goes into more detail. He doesn't. He says, if you think what an infinite number of beings you would be able to help if you had those qualities, that is the aspirational faith. That's right. That's why I chose the word aspirational more than longing, because you can see how your practice might benefit others in the way that we sort of recite the bodhicitta prayer at the very beginning. It's trying to stir aspirational faith here. When you continue then to practice, and your experiences start really showing you that the Buddha's teachings actually seem to be true for you, then it becomes something called confident faith. It's not just confidence, but it's confident faith. This is why using the word confidence in place of faith, it's not quite enough. And then once you have become really changed by the teachings and the practices, you embody them, they're with you on a regular basis, then this is called irreversible faith. Now, so this means that we are now sort of carrying the realizations of the teachings and our own experiences into our lives. There's another little book that is really a great little book by Sharon Salzberg, the Vipassana teacher, called Faith, Trusting in Your Own Deepest Experience. Great little book. It's very easy to read. And she tells her own story about the difference that she realized between blind faith and bright faith. And here, bright faith is really more so trusting in your own deepest experiences. They're sort of truths, insights that come to you. It's a nice way to think about it, as opposed to just believing whatever is told to you by a teacher or by even the Buddha himself, just categorically believing it. We're constantly being challenged to make sense of this, and yet we still do also want to have confidence in the teachers and in their own realizations, and maybe assume the best, perhaps. But again, faith is not an assumption in this way, but rather the way that Sharon Salzberg talks about it is that we recognize our potential to transform suffering, what we might call here and then confident faith. And when it becomes instituted, when we're able to apply this regularly, then irreversible faith, meaning that we don't start backsliding, even if we do feel like we're not doing well today. I can't find it today. It's more so the longer arc. It's that recovery process. It's the kind of the resilience of our spirituality. So just a couple more points here about faith. Here's an interesting thing, is that faith in the Abhidharma, as it's brought up in Abhidharma, is seen to rely on a pliancy of mind, that the mind needs to be adaptable in order to realize faith. It's kind of a new concept for me when I learned about this back in college, actually. Rigidity, or rigid views, is seen to block faith. Isn't that interesting? Considering that in some religions, absolutism, rigidity actually seems to be a quote-unquote strong faith. In Buddhism, it's slightly different. Why? Because faith relies on a very subtle, deeper sense of perception and intuitive subtleties, so that we can be skillful. Skillfulness is not often talked about in the context of faith. And yet, as a very practical tradition, bodhicitta means really being able to respond to suffering skillfully. So we need to have that faith in the intuition, the insight, the wisdom of our own experiences of the heart, as well as from the teachings and our teachers and our friends, our kalyana mitras, or our spiritual friends. I also feel like there is an aspect of devotion in faith. So devotion to whom, or to what? Well, this is where the pliancy comes in. Because yes, we may be devoted to easing suffering for others. We're devoted to their well-being. We are devoted to, and this doesn't mean like over trying, right? To the point where we're operating out of a neediness to control or make things better. But it's more of just an easy, open devotion, an aspiration that all beings be well and safe and wise and free from suffering. One last interesting part of faith here from the Abhidharma is self-surrender. Wow, this starts getting to the heart, really, of Vajrayana teachings as well. Relinquishing, letting go of ego, surrendering the personality, the separate self, if you will. Without faith, how do we do this? Yeah. And so this is now starting to lead into the other theme for tonight, which are ways perhaps that we can be invited in to cultivating a certain kind of faith. So before I go there, one last point. There is a text called The Awakening of Faith by Ashvaghosha. Ashvaghosha, great yogi who wrote this text. Often, I believe this was a text that was translated from the Chinese, preserved in the Chinese. Very central to especially Buddhism in East Asia. A really lovely text. And in that text, Ashvaghosha is letting us know what faith constitutes sort of from that lineage and that tradition. And part of what it is having faith in our underlying Buddha nature. Having faith in what's called the Tathagata. The Tathagata, the awakened one, that aspect of who we are, that we all carry, that is already awake. Or the Tathagata Garbha. Garbha is like a seed or womb source, so the source of awakening. And so in this text, this is what Ashvaghosha is really saying. He is saying that, yes, faith in the three jewels. Tathagata literally means the one who has thus gone, or the thus gone one. This is another way often it's translated, but it's also in the context of basic goodness. Faith is also a knowing, and an experiential knowing of our own underlying basic goodness, that actually we're not made of sinfulness. We're not inherently evil or quote unquote bad. Cause and effect, yes. But ultimately when we're born with this inherent basic goodness that can easily get impacted by conditioning, by the things we experience, painfulness, the three poisons, both arising in us and also responding to us from the outside. But this is the point, that we have this capacity already for bodhicitta. We have this capacity, this naturalness to the mind of awakening is already there. It's just, it needs to be tended to and cultivated and curated. And faith, also perhaps relying on the beings, our benefactors, the deities, if you will, on those who have supported us and continue to love us and support us unconditionally, perhaps our teachers. So anyway, I think there is a video on YouTube, on the Clear Path YouTube channel, where we went through each of the 5 indriyas. So one of them is on faith specifically. So if you are interested in this theme, you can certainly seek that out. If you can find it, there's a lot of content on there. So the last thing about faith for now is just also faith in the truth of freedom. The Four Noble Truths, perhaps. Faith in the process of the Eightfold Path, that it's leading us It's not a linear thing. It's more of a circular spiral. We tend to encounter the different stages of the Eightfold Path in different ways when we are working our way through the ethical parts, the concentrative parts, and so on.